Hello, and welcome to the Godot community for High School Visual Art 3D. The following slides will continue the discussion on mold making and slip casting.
When your tile is complete, you want to go ahead and prepare it for casting your mold. So you want to pick a container. This one is not ideal, but I'm going to use it. It will work. It has, you can see, I can press on it. So it does have a little bit of a bubble up on the bottom. But I'm going to fit my tile in here anyway. Whatever container you select, you want to make sure it has some flexibility. So you don't want to use glass or metal. You want to stick with plastic. And you want to make sure that there is enough area around your tile so that your mold isn't too thin on the wall. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply, the fancy term is release agent, but in fact, I'm just using a little bit of dish soap. Murphy's oil soap tends to be the preferred release agent. And basically, this mold that we've made is a throwaway mold, meaning that after our plaster has set, we are going to dig this clay out of that plaster. So it is not going to be intact any longer. So to make it come out of that plaster a little bit more easily, if you apply soap, it does create somewhat of a barrier between your clay and the plaster so that it releases more easily, and also so that you don't damage or lose detail in taking it out. Now, the way that I'm applying this soap, and I'm, again, just using regular dish soap because I did not have Murphy's oil soap today, I'm sort of dabbing it on. If you are too vigorous with your application, then you can create bubbles, and the plaster will certainly pick those bubbles up in the casting of the mold. And you don't want to forget to get these edges either. And the way that I have the tile laying in this container, I haven't secured it in any way. And depending on what I'm casting, sometimes I will just rely on gravity, in which case you may get a little bit of plaster underneath your mold. But you can also take some small coils and run them around the perimeter of your form that you're casting. However, when you do that, you potentially are compromising the dimensions of your tile. So you kind of have to figure that in when you're securing your tile. Now, I can also see that some of this soap, where it's a little bit thicker, is creating a bit of a pattern. So I may go back over those areas and try to smooth them out with my brush a little bit. Or if that doesn't bother you, then good for you. You don't have to immerse yourself in the tedium like I find myself doing sometimes. Also, remember to continue to kind of watch for suds. Once in a while, I'll just squeeze the soap out of my brush, and that tends to get rid of some of the suds that start to crop up that you don't want to be part of your design here. Also, in these little recessed areas, these little almost pinhole areas, sometimes a little air bubble or air pocket can form over tiny areas of texture. And I usually try to pop those because sometimes the pocket will stay and the plaster will just pour over it and not into it. and you'll lose that detail. So any small detail that you see is filled with soap or might have an air pocket, you want to try to get that taken care of with your brush. So now my tile is ready for casting. We are ready to go ahead and mix our plaster. You can use plaster that you get at a home supply store that's just regular plaster of Paris. I actually use a type of molding plaster that I get from a construction supply company that I think is a little bit harder and more durable. The hardness of the plaster is really going to be dependent on how much plaster to water you mix. And I typically don't go by what the directions are. You certainly can. Most people that I know, when they mix their plaster, just use what we refer to as the mountain method, which is mixing the plaster, pouring the plaster into the water until eventually it floats on top, meaning that enough of the plaster particles have created a dense enough solution to support the plaster on top, and that kind of gives you the idea that you have enough. I'm mixing my plaster in hot water, and the water temperature really does affect the time that it takes for your plaster to set up. So the hotter the water, the quicker it sets up. So since I am not working with plaster in a way where I am waiting for it to stiffen up so that I can manipulate it or otherwise, push it around, I just want to pour it in that mold, then I don't really need to be too concerned with it setting up too quickly. It's not going to set up. I mean, you're still going to have plenty of time to mix it and get it to where you want it to be to make your mold. So we see that the plaster is starting to sit on the surface. And you might have seen that I was running the plaster through my hands. And I do that just because I buy pretty large bags of plaster, and you have students using them. And once in a while, a student might dip into the plaster with a wet cup. And so obviously plaster hardens due to a chemical change. So once plaster comes in contact with water, it starts that chemical change, and that chemical change cannot be undone. So if you have plaster that you have that has already set, it's important that students understand that grinding that back into a powder will not make it back to its original state. So once it's been combined with water, it undergoes a chemical change. So once again, talking about chemistry with regard to art is another one of those interdisciplinary or art integration areas. So you can see that the plaster is sort of creamy. It is definitely thicker than just water. You can see that it sticks to my hands. I'm going to go ahead and wipe it off of my hands. Because of the fact that we are using hot water, I do not want to hold off. I'm going to go ahead and pour this into my mold.